Okay, so let's move to the keynote that will be delivered by Dr. Laura Bean Freeman. Laura is the world cancer pesticides expert, and she's well known for her studies in the Ag Health and cohort, and for her involvement in our societies. She's chair of EPICO since a few months now, a very, very successful cancer epidemiologist, and she has a title that's a bit obscure, Occupational Cohorts for Cancer Research Perspectives from the NCI. I guess we're going to get perspectives from Laura. That is good enough, I think, for us. So, Laura.
Thank you, Manolis. Do you see my screen? And do you see the right version? You don't see the notes. Actually, I first want to thank you for the opportunity to speak to you today. And I also want to thank you, as Kurt indicated, for starting a little bit later than you did yesterday. I was really interested in all of the talks yesterday morning, but 4 o'clock was a little early to be on camera. So I appreciate that. I also am very excited to be here. I've been an observer of OmegaNet since maybe almost the beginning. I remember Michelle and Manolis presenting a poster back in 2018, I think, at the ISEE meeting, and then of course attended the symposium at EPICO in 2019 and the online presentations at the virtual EPICO meeting last year. But I really had no idea. I sort of had a vague idea of some of the things that you were working on, but hearing all of the work that you've been doing, and particularly under the challenging circumstances of trying to build a network in the middle of a global pandemic, it's really amazing what you've been able to accomplish. And then I would like to say that Manolis sort of hits on a note on his comment on my title. When Damien initially asked me to give a talk, he said he wanted to give me the perspective, NCI's perspective on occupational cohorts. And I couldn't possibly do that. It's a big research organization and probably has as many perspectives as there are people. But what I will give is maybe perspectives from the NCI, someone who has been working there for almost 20 years. And I hope that what I am going to talk about is useful to you as you think about going forward. It's a little bit of our own research philosophy and a little bit of how we conduct our occupational research. But I am certainly aware that I am in the middle of a group of people who are doing occupational research in cohort studies. And so I'm a little humble about that as well. One thing that I thought might be useful in giving a little bit of perspective. Let's see, my slides are not advancing, just a minute. Okay, so first saying perspectives from the NCI. Here's our beautiful building where we sit, and I would welcome all of you to come visit once the pandemic is over. I acknowledge that the view is not quite as nice as it is from IS Global, but we do have a little pond that we can look out on. But I thought it might be useful to kind of give some context for the research that we do at the NCI, because I think it really underpins a lot of the work that we do and the reasons for some of the work that we do and how we do it. The NCI is a government institute. It is part of the National Institutes of Health, which is the major funder of biomedical research in the United States and around the world as well. And most of what the NCI funds is actually work that is done at universities and other extramural government aid, extramural organizations. But there is an intramural research program, meaning research that is being done at the institute itself. And that's where I sit, and that's where I do my work, and that's in the Division of Cancer Epidemiology and Genetics. And this is important because we're not on a grant funding cycle, so we do not write grants. In fact, in most cases, we're prohibited from writing grants that people at universities would be eligible to apply for. We do have our own internal scientific review process and have to compete for funds. But what it means is that practically what this means is that we can invest in longer term studies, such as cohort studies, that require large investments of time and money and are not dependent on, I mean, they're dependent on publications, but maybe not so much as if you were having to renew a grant every 5 years. And I think that the best example of this, for those of you who attended the EPICO 2020 webinars, where Deborah Silverman received the Lifetime Achievement Award and talked about her saga, really, of the diesel exhaust in miners study, which was over 20 years of work in the face of great adversity and challenges in the courts and things just to get the study published. And I think that that's, obviously a very extreme example of the kind of work that we do, but this is the sort of work that we really kind of invest in. So we are in the Occupational and Environmental Epidemiology branch, or I am in the Occupational and Environmental Epidemiology branch, which is one of many branches within our division of cancer epidemiology and genetics. And our branch research mission is to combine epidemiology, quantitative exposure assessment, and molecular components into multidisciplinary studies to provide insights into cancer etiology, carcinogenesis, and mechanisms of action. And I think that I always try to think back to that as the underpinnings of our work. So we have several cohort studies that are housed within our branch. Many of them are industry-based cohort studies. As Kurt alluded to, many of these have, in his remarks yesterday, rely on quantitative exposure assessment and really in highly exposed populations with the goal of identifying or clarifying associations for cancer. We do sometimes also look at other disease outcomes, but since we are the National Cancer Institute, our main goal is to evaluate cancer associations. Some of these studies are quite old. Our formaldehyde exposure and acrylonitrile study cohorts are quite old, although they have been very valuable in providing insights into to carcinogenesis and cancer related to those exposures. They're mostly mortality studies without biological specimens. Some of our newer studies have incorporated either biomarker studies within the cohort itself or as an adjunct to the cohort studies. And that's really because, as we know, sometimes we observe associations that kind of the epidemiology is ahead of toxicology, or the toxicology and the epidemiology maybe don't quite line up. So we try to provide insight into mechanisms of action or the plausibility of the observations that we're seeing. In that case, we look to initiate molecular studies, and we're also very aware of finding opportunities to replicate our findings where possible. I'm going to just give an example, and as Manolis said, a lot of my work is done within the agricultural health study cohort study. You'd think I'd be able to say it at this point, but I'm the NCI PI of this study, but I certainly cannot take credit for its initiation. And I think it is also an example of an investment, a long-term investment by multiple federal agencies. It really was the brainchild of Aaron Blair and Michael Olivagna at NCI and of Dale Sandler at NIEHS, with input from exposure assessors at EPA and NIOSH, who ran exposure studies to help support the study. I'm not going to belabor the details of the study because they're kind of beside the point, but basically the cohort was initiated in the mid-1990s. It includes 57,000 farmers, pesticide applicators. At this point in time, we've been following them for, the median follow-up is over 20 years and the median age is 67. We have over 10,000 incident cancers among our applicators. We also have a component that includes their wives. And the reason that this study was really initiated was to evaluate pesticides and other agricultural exposures with a wide variety of health outcomes. And I feel bad reducing our exposure assessment to 2 bullet points on this slide, but know that many field studies and a lot of work went into this exposure assessment that is anchored in our questionnaires of use of specific pesticides. but it really is one of the hallmarks of the study as well. So I'm going to just talk through an example of multiple myeloma and how we sort of think about doing research within the study on this topic. So multiple myeloma has been observed to be increased in farmers in many studies, going back to studies conducted in the 80s. There was a meta-analysis published in 1997 that showed a modest but increased risk. We see the similar increase in the ag health study for our farmers compared to the general population. And of course, when you see something like this in an occupational group, you hypothesize that, what is the main exposure? And of course, pesticides would be the one that the exposure that people would most think would be responsible for this, although there are other hypotheses as well. So in 2014, we published a paper looking at insecticides and cancers of lymphomas and multiple myeloma. And we observed that there was an increased risk of permethrin with multiple myeloma. Now, this is, a pretty strong finding, but we don't really know what do we do with this information, because there aren't very many studies of permethrin and multiple myeloma, and there aren't very many studies of pesticides and cancer. And so this is one of these situations where we look to sort of augment our knowledge on this topic in multiple ways. And so just briefly about permethrin, it's a synthetic pyrethroid insecticide. It has both agricultural uses, but also has wide-ranging use for impregnating clothing for recreation and military use, and tick collars. And importantly, it's been classified by the EPA as likely, the US EPA, as likely carcinogenic to humans based on experimental evidence. So in 2010, we initiated a study called the Biomarkers of Exposure and Effect in Agriculture, which includes about 1,700 male farmers from the Agricultural Health Study, to look at a variety of, to provide some biologic plausibility to some of the observations that we are seeing in the Ag Health Study. And importantly, we have information, a full exposure history on these 1,700 farmers. And so we can look at both their lifetime use and their more recent exposure to pesticides. So something that is unique to myeloma is that it is there's an obligate precursor called monoclonal gammopathy of undetermined significance. It is got a slow progression to multiple myeloma, but it really is an obligate precursor. So we wondered if MGUS was also elevated as was multiple myeloma, or if the multiple myeloma excess was driven more by a later stage the activity. So what we did was look at the prevalence of MGUS in our BIA study and compared it to a nationally representative sample, NHANES, and also to a population within Olmsted County, Minnesota, which is geographically close to at least one of the states in the Ag Health Study. And indeed, we found that there was an increased prevalence of MGUS in addition to the increase in the disease itself. So then we evaluated whether or not permethrin was also associated with increased risk of MGUS. And in fact, we do see that among the people who had both past and more recent use of permethrin, we saw the odds ratio was about 2.5. And we saw no such increases in some of the other commonly used pesticides in the recently exposed group. So that tells us that maybe this gives us some indications that this is maybe real. But we then conducted a longitudinal study of permethrin exposed applicators in our BIA study, where we collected off-season blood and urine, and then it was a very intensive study actually, and really challenging to do, to get the timing exactly right, because these pesticides are applied very intermittently. where we went and collected blood 1 day after the application and then about 3 weeks after the application. And you can see in the panel on the right that the urinary levels of one of the main permethrin metabolites increases, as you would expect, 1 day after application, and goes back to almost off-season levels about 3 weeks later. So we felt like we were really capturing the relevant exposure window. So then we evaluated whether or not the permethrin use was altering markers in the immune system, and we indeed found that in the 1 day after application, the immature granulocytes were increased relative to the off-season, and the red blood cells were decreased. So we also look for ways to replicate findings, and this has sort of some echoes of some of the things that you're doing within OmegaNet, and this was really to try to look at multiple pesticides and try to replicate some of the ag health findings and to look at other pesticides as well. And that is within our AgriCo consortium. This was actually also the brainchild initially of Aaron Blair before he retired, and we had a meeting clear back in 2006, I believe, to bring together the cohorts who were doing work in agriculture. And I'm hearing a lot of the some of the networking and things that have happened within OmegaNet, I think, has been one of the benefits of AgriCo as well. And some of the challenges that we have seen are really the pooling of data, the harmonization of exposure outcomes, the harmonization of cancer outcomes. And it really has been much more challenging than I think that any of us had kind of thought at the beginning. We conducted our first etiologic paper was published on pesticides in 2019, led by Maria Leon from IARC. And just referring back to the permethrin case with multiple myeloma based on 187 permethrin exposed cases, there was a suggestion of an increased risk of multiple myeloma. And we're now currently looking to expand these to do exposure response analyses. Another thing that we're really interested in and thinking about is time windows of exposure. And so we're launching a cohort of the offspring of the agricultural health study participants to really look at their early life exposures in cancer in childhood and early adulthood. We have currently identified over 60,000 adult offspring of the ag health study participants. We're about to start enrollment. We've developed a fully online questionnaire, and then we also will combine the information that we'll collect from them with information from their parents who are the ag health study participants. And so in many instances, we'll have full families of mothers and fathers and multiple offspring. So I think it really will allow us to do a lot of really interesting analyses focused on time windows and familial risks. Just getting back to our branch research mission, as I said at the beginning, it's multifaceted, and I've used sort of our agricultural work as an example of some of the things that we're focused on, but we're really thinking about many topics. And I was gratified to see in your presentation yesterday, Kirk, that I think it was the HERA group that had identified many of the same things that we're thinking about, which is, of course, mixtures, which everybody's thinking about, time windows of exposure and susceptibility, methodologic issues related particularly to occupational research, such as the healthy worker survivor effect. And also we have an exposure assessment team led by Melissa Freeman for occupation, which is working on automated coding of occupation and industry and smartphone activity trackers. Just in terms of making resources available, I just wanted to give a mention to two tools that may be of interest to the OmegaNet group if you're not already aware, that we have publicly available job modules for occupational questionnaires, for building occupational questionnaires focused on 40 specific jobs and 10 specific industries. These are really helpful in population-based studies in particular. They were developed by Trish Stewart and Mustafa Dosamechi, who are our long-term industrial hygienist, and now has been taken over by Melissa Freeman. And then Melissa has developed a standardized occupational coding for computer-assisted epidemiologic research, or SOCR, which really is an automated system. And I know that there are others that you're aware of that really cut down on the need for individual level review of occupation and industry. So now I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about a new resource that I think could be of interest to the OmegaNet group for opportunities and for collaboration, but also touches on many of the things that Michelle was talking about in her last slide in the last session, which is sort of, developing resources that are available to everyone and based on FAIR principles. So our division has launched a new cancer cohort study. It just started recruiting in the last 6 months, and it's called the Connect for Cancer Prevention Study. It's really focused on cancer etiology, cancer risk prediction, and survivorship issues, but there are elements of the resource that are relevant to occupation, and I think could be a real provide interesting opportunities. So the key research priority areas are emerging exposures, novel biomarkers, and using cutting edge methodology, and also diverse and special populations within the United States. We're recruiting, we are attempting to recruit 200,000 adults in the US, ages 40 to 65. They'll be recruited from health systems, healthcare systems within the US. Those of you in Europe will probably scoff at our healthcare system because it's not really a healthcare system, but they will be recruited from the organizations that are providing their healthcare for them, which will allow us to have access to their electronic health records and things that would not be possible otherwise. There will be serial assessments to observe longitudinal changes. And at this point, these are the areas from which they're recruiting, although the study will likely expand as recruitment gets up and going. Everything is going to be done through an app that people can install on their phones, which will hopefully make communication and retention go a lot more smoothly. We'll be collecting a lot of different kinds of information, both from surveys and specimens, and it will also be a very flexible study so that enhanced activities and add-on studies can be implemented within special populations relatively easily. So the background, the baseline questionnaire, I think, is really important that we are asking about occupation. You can imagine that a resource such as this, there are lots of people who want their favorite thing to be included, and we did fight pretty hard to get occupation included in the baseline questionnaire, because I think that will allow us to do some interesting research. And one of the enhancements is the inclusion of SOCR in the field. So as I mentioned, SOCR is an automated coding system, and this actually SOCR in the field actually integrates that directly into the online questionnaire. So if the person is asked, what is your current job title, and they say organic chemist, the system automatically populates possibilities, and the participant themselves can help choose what most describes their job so we think that will actually reduce the amount of miscoding, and we think this will be really interesting because we can use this to identify high priority occupations for follow-up questionnaires and follow-up activities. And we'll have this information for both the current job and the longest held job. We'll have duration of those jobs as well. Of course, being a modern cohort, it will have all sorts of biospecimens for use. And these are the planned follow-up questionnaires. But as I said, there will be opportunities to augment this work. We will be linking to cancer registries, geospatial data, mortality, of course, and then we'll also use their healthcare records. We'll have geographic information, geocoding their address histories, and we'll be able to use the app to add daily movement and travel to exposure information. We're also incorporating wearable devices and apps for things such as sleep and light at night that I know are of interest to some in this group, and hope to be able to do some additional occupational exposure work in this area as well. So, even with a cohort this big, since we're enrolling people at relatively young ages, it takes a while for outcomes to really accrue. But in the meantime, we can also look at precursor lesions for cancer. Really, this is, I would say, is our first big effort at the NCI in our cohort studies to really create a fair data ecosystem from the very beginning, so that all of the data that are collected are really available to people, and they can use them, and they can be combined with other data. And I think this is really the way that the research world is going and should be going. So we really view this as a resource for the scientific community. It's not just an NCI study, or not just an intramural research program study. And I really want to highlight that this, is built into really the DNA of the study, that there will be access to people all over the world, and people who want to use this as a resource for doing their own research. We're developing the approval process. So once recruitment has gotten a little further along, this will be made publicly available. But this is basically the idea that anyone can submit a summary of an enhancement that they would like to do within the study. It will be reviewed internally and developed using a protocol that's approved by the working group. And then the coordinating center would really manage all the contact with the participants. So, of course, different levels of data access are possible depending on your role and where you're located. But really, we intend to make these data as freely available as possible. Just to give you a sense of the timeline, we started the recruitment last year, and it will go really wrapping up in the beginning of 2027. But one of the benefits of doing the real-time occupational coding is that we can identify high-profile or high priority occupations for add-on studies even before the end of recruitment, if there are exposures that you're particularly interested in. And that's what I wanted to say about Connect. And I also wanted to acknowledge collaborators, many collaborators. This is just an abbreviated list, but many people have worked on all of these studies throughout the years. And I think this will be part of our discussion, hopefully in the panel discussion. But as Manola's mentioned, I'm newly elected as the chair of the Ethical Management Committee. We also have Mary Zubair-Berrigan, who's on the management committee with me. And one of the things that we really want to focus on in our triennium term is building up more capacity for early career researchers. And I think that there's a lot of potential synergy for things that OmegaNet is working on. And I think that training, mentoring, and we've had some initial conversations about potentially hosting a virtual conference. There's a lot of alignment with things that we are interested in as a management committee, that we're hearing from our early career researchers that they're interested in. And so I would like to I hope that that's part of the discussion today. And then finally, I would be remiss if I didn't at least mention that we have lots of training opportunities at NCI as well. from pre-doctoral and postdoctoral fellowships, or even just coming and spending a short amount of time with us. We all benefit, I think, from those types of collaborations, and I really hope that that we can support and promote that. And I really think that we're a little bit on the outside at NCI from OmegaNet, but hopefully, if OmegaNet goes forward, that maybe we can be more engaged. So with that, I would be very happy to take any questions that you have.
Thanks a lot, Laura. That was great, and it's great to hear from you. Ag Health and all the other work, but Ag Health is definitely, the reference cohort in pesticides exposure. And your work has been exceptional. Yours and the team's work.
Right. Well, I think it's an example. I really use it. I think as an example is the approach that we use a lot. But yeah.
Okay, let me start with a question, and then we'll move to the chat. The NCI, the DCG, the OEB of the DC, well, Aaron's old group and Deborah's group now, was one of the first groups to develop tools and a very strong group in exposure assessment. In North America, we had first the development in Montreal with Jack Semiatiki and Michel Gérin and the others. And then you had Trish, Stuart, and Mustafa. So, and you mentioned fairly quickly on your talk about what you're doing in exposure assessment on, if I understood well, you're focusing mostly on developing e-health tools and tools for a semi-automatic coding of occupation. These are the two priorities.
I think that those are areas that we really are working in. We really are focused on. So Melissa Freeman is now the head of our occupational exposure assessment group. She and I have had a lot of conversations about developing. It's important to develop exposure assessment tools, but it's most useful when it's related to a hypothesis or something that we really need for our studies. One of the things that I didn't really talk about very much, but I did mention in one of the slides, was also the development of smartphone activity trackers. We actually conducted a pilot study of agricultural activities, presented a poster. We had a poster on this at EPICO last fall, where we used smartphone trackers, and we developed actually a whole rubric for people to log the actual agricultural activities that could be adapted for other occupations and industries that people are doing. It's quite flexible. And I think that, so that's another area that we're working in.
Okay, let's move to the chat. We have a first comment by Michelle on comparison and combination with the older cohort. Well, Michelle, why don't you say your question, your comment?
Just a quick question for Laura. I was curious to know, what are the main differences between the new cohort that you just described and the Cancer Prevention Study 3 cohort? They sound kind of similar.
They're a little bit similar. So so we are within the healthcare system itself. So we're recruiting people through their healthcare providers. So we have direct access to their electronic records. CPS3 is also population based in some sense, but it doesn't, my understanding is it does not have quite that level of detail. But I think that they're complementary to one another and they're not exactly the same, but they have some similarities. But I think that the Connect is really, since it's being developed now or more in a more modern era, even though since things are so rapidly evolving, I think that we're able to implement some things that CPS3 was not able to.
Okay, let's move to Joe Stenham about the biomarker study. Joe, do you want to?
Yeah, hi. Thank you. Maybe I'll do like this. Yeah. Hi, I'm here with Tom Grimsby as well.
Hi.
Hi. Was wondering if you just could give me some quick comment on the BEA sub-study. How
Sure.
did you do it? Because we maybe want to do something similar with the offshore worker cohort that we have here. Thanks.
Yeah, so, and I'm looking at your question in the chat. We identified, because we were interested in cancer as our primary outcome, we did exclude people who were who had a cancer diagnosis prior to 2010. We also, because we wanted to use all of their exposure information, we restricted it to people who had completed all of our exposure questionnaires. And then because we were, one of our high priority analyses was focused on MGUS, which increases dramatically after age 50, we didn't include anybody younger than age 50, but that was really not much of a restriction because we, the cohort is getting older anyway, so there weren't that many people. But we have a lot more information on the website about the study. And of course, either me or John Hoffman, who's the PI of the BIA study, I'm sure would be happy to talk to you about that.
Joe, any follow-up on this or?
No, thank you. Thank you so much, Laura. That was nice.
Okay, so Kurt Strife, who's asking about the possibilities of follow-up in the older cohorts. Kurt, and you're talking about acrylonitrile specifically?
No, that was just one specific example, but first of all, thank you, Laura, for your excellent talk. I think it again shows that the Omega Cost Initiative needs to be a global initiative, including not only the NCI, but also Debbie from Australia and all the other countries globally. And specifically, my question was, I understand there's a new kind of US-wide cancer registry initiative that will make access to cancer incidence data easier. So could some of your old mortality studies be more easily followed up? And there are certainly still open questions like acrylonitrile.
Yeah, actually, that's something that we've been thinking about too. And in particular, I would be really interested in linking our formaldehyde cohort to a global or a nationwide cancer registry, because I think from my perspective, one of the limitations of the formaldehyde research is not focused on cancer incidence for the most part. Unfortunately, many of those old cohorts, the bulk of their deaths occurred before the advent of the cancer registries. So even if it's a nationwide registry, many of them the early ones started in the late 70s or the early 80s. And a lot of our deaths occurred, in the 70s or 60s or in the 80s. So we're doing some initial calculations, both, I know that Stella and Deborah have been thinking about for the acrylonitrile study. I had done some initial evaluations of that for the formaldehyde study and just decided that it really wasn't going to be beneficial because the time period isn't right.
I didn't know that there were still some controversies regarding formaldehyde. No comment needed.
I don't know the controversy, but from my perspective, I think that some cancer incidence studies would.
No, I was joking, sorry.
I know.
Okay, these are IAC monograph jokes, okay.
Yes.
So, Susan Peters, about other outcomes. Susan?
Yeah, hi, thanks, Laura, for a great talk. Yeah, I was just wondering, of course, NCI has cancer as a major, the focus, of course, it's in the name. But I was just wondering if you think this connects, or this new cohort would be suitable for other, I'm thinking of course, neurodegenerative disease
Sure.
with more long-term effects, like we also use EPIC, for example, it was originally set up for cancer, but I think we can use that for other health outcomes.
Yeah, I think that would be a big enhancement for the study. And of course, we're focused on cancer, being the Cancer Institute, but I think that particularly because they'll be linking to the electronic health records, we don't have registries for Parkinson's disease, but there could be either enhancements to the questionnaire data for people with particular exposures or linking to the health records that could make that useful as well.
Yeah, thank you. I think, it would be interesting to talk about this a bit more sometime. Yeah.
No, and I really think that, I adapted the slides from Mia Gaudet, who's the chief scientist supporting the Connect cohort. And it really is, they really are serious when they want this to be utilized by many people. So we really are trying to build that into the, sort of the infrastructure of the study overall. So.
Okay, unfortunately, we'll have to stop here because we have very little time for a break and then for the next session. Laura, thanks really a lot.
Oh, thank you so much.
nice.
I really, I do mean it when I say that one of the things that I really appreciate about this group is, the sort of the bolus of people who are thinking about occupational epidemiology that we just don't have, I think, in North America. Thank you.
Yeah, that was another question, but that's it would require a long answer, so let's leave it apart.